Early 1997, Albania descends into chaos. Buildings burning, 650,000 weapons looted, 2,000 people killed, all caused by a pyramid scheme. In 1991, Albania left behind nearly 5 decades of extreme isolation under the communist regime of Enver Hoxha. For almost half a century, the state had prohibited private property and tightly controlled all financial transactions, keeping the population entirely insulated from the outside world. When this system collapsed, 3 million citizens suddenly entered a free market economy without any previous exposure to consumer banking or basic financial concepts. The transition occurred at a rapid pace, but without the institutional structures to support it. State-owned industries were quickly privatized, and informal markets expanded across the country long before the government could establish regulatory bodies or legal protections. For ordinary citizens, survival remained difficult. The average monthly wage was only about $80, making basic necessities hard to afford. Consequently, cash remittances sent home by families working in neighboring Greece and Italy became an important resource for household survival. With commercial banks unable to offer reliable services, there was no secure place for people to save or grow their money. The state had no effective oversight for securities, and financial education was virtually non-existent. Families who had never managed bank accounts or evaluated market risks were forced to make financial decisions using limited information. This combination of low wages, massive cash inflows from abroad, and a complete absence of regulatory safeguards left the population highly vulnerable to unregulated financial actors. In 1993, the first unregulated investment companies and foundations appeared in Albania. Over the next 3 years, roughly 25 of these entities began operating openly, offering monthly returns of 10 to 25%, rates far beyond what any productive economic activity could support. To attract depositors, these firms cultivated an image of corporate legitimacy. Vefa Holding, established by Vabi Alimuka, built public trust by acquiring highly visible assets including hotels, fuel stations, retail shops, and factories. Tens of thousands of creditors saw these physical enterprises as proof of secure, asset-backed investments. Similarly, Gallica, led by Shemzi Kadria, used its commercial projects in the language of secure savings to project stability. Other operators, including Sude, Populi, Kamberi, Silva, Sinaj, and the Haferi Foundation, led by Bashkim Dridza, entered the market, turning the financial sector into a highly competitive arena. Behind the storefronts, the business model was simple. The firms did not generate wealth through their commercial investments. Instead, they used the cash from new depositors to pay the monthly interest of earlier participants. This structure required a constant expanding supply of new money. To keep the deposits flowing, the firms entered an intense interest rate war, constantly raising their monthly interest offers to outbid their competitors and prevent the system from halting. By 1996, these unregulated operations had effectively replaced the state banking sector, functioning as a parallel financial system that held the vast majority of household wealth. Out of a total population of roughly 3 million people, an estimated 2 million Albanians became active depositors. The scale of involvement crossed every social stratum, drawing in rural farmers, urban professionals, municipal workers, and pensioners. To raise the cash required for deposits, families went far beyond committing standard wages. Many sold their family homes, agricultural land, and livestock. These domestic assets were continuously pooled with foreign remittances sent home by Albanians working in Greece and Italy. Local economists observed that the sheer volume of cash entering these offices bypassed the formal banking sector entirely, leaving public banks virtually empty. The total volume of deposits eventually reached approximately $1.2 billion, a sum equivalent to nearly half of Albania's entire gross domestic product. The institutions managing this capital secured widespread public legitimacy. legitimacy through avenues outside of traditional banking. They launched aggressive national advertising campaigns, sponsored major cultural events, funded local football clubs, and maintained close, highly visible relationships with prominent political figures. These actions, combined with close-knit community trust networks, convinced ordinary citizens that the firms were secure, state-sanctioned enterprises. Because families had staked their entire survival on these returns, the financial security of the household unit became inextricably linked to the survival of the schemes. This unprecedented concentration of private wealth meant that any sudden disruption to the system would immediately threaten both individual savers and the fundamental stability of the entire nation. In mid-November 1996, the first major default of an informal investment fund shook public confidence, exposing the structural instability of the parallel financial system. For months, the International Monetary Fund warned the government that these unregulated operations were unsustainable and threatened macroeconomic stability. IMF analyses indicated that collective liabilities had reached nearly half of Albania's gross domestic product. Rather than closing the operations, the government established a transparency commission in late 1996. This commission lacked the authority to halt transactions, allowing the firms to continue soliciting cash from the public. By January 1997, the system imploded. Multiple funds suspended payments almost overnight. Families who had recently surrendered their ancestral land deeds or deposited years of foreign remittances found the office doors locked and their life savings completely inaccessible. The promised monthly returns stopped, leaving depositors with worthless paper receipts instead of secure assets. To contain the panic, the Bank of Albania froze the bank accounts of two of the largest schemes, which held approximately $250 million. The central bank also imposed strict daily withdrawal limits to prevent complete capital flight. Yet, the central administration resisted broader international demands to shut down the remaining operations and implement comprehensive banking oversight. In response to this persistent refusal to act, the IMF suspended its credit lines, isolating the country's formal financial sector. The paper trail from this period reveals a government deadlocked between political survival and financial reality, even as the scale of the private losses began to threaten the legitimacy of the state itself. On January 30, 1997, opposition figures and human rights advocates established the Forum for Democracy. This coalition sought to coordinate the growing public anger, turning local grievances into an organized political movement against the government of President Sali Berisha. In the southern port city of Vlorë, protests that had begun as demands for financial compensation quickly escalated into a direct challenge to state authority. By February 9th, thousands of residents filled the streets. The demonstrations turned violent as crowds targeted symbols of state power. Protesters clashed with security forces, eventually storming the local police station. The next day, the regional headquarters of the ruling Democratic Party was set on fire. The unrest spread rapidly to other southern municipalities, including Lushnja and Gjirokastër. Government buildings, municipal archives, and police stations were systematically ransacked and burned. Contemporary reporting by journalist Alez Biberaj and subsequent military records documented a total breakdown of administrative control. Police units and military detachments, facing unpaid wages and divided loyalties, abandoned their posts. This institutional collapse allowed civilians to storm unguarded military depots and armories. Citizens of all ages seized vast quantities of military equipment. Automatic rifles, pistols, hand grenades, and explosives were carried away in trucks, carts, and by hand. Analysts estimate that approximately 650,000 weapons entered civilian hands, effectively ending the state's monopoly on physical force. Armed civilian committees took control of several southern cities, establishing barricades and checkpoints. With control of the country slipping away, Prime Minister Alexander Mexi resigned on March 1st. The following day, March 2nd, President Sali Berisha declared a nationwide state of emergency, imposing curfews and media restrictions while authorizing the military to defend remaining government installations. Scholars and international observers continue to debate how to classify the events of early 1997. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe characterized the crisis as civil unrest, whereas many historians, pointing to the organized rebel committees and the sheer volume of armed combatants, describe the period as an armed uprising or a civil war. On March 28, 1997, as state authority collapsed across Albania, the motorboat Catastrophe departed from the southern port of Vlorë. On board were 142 people, including entire families, desperate to cross the Strait of Otranto to find safety in Italy. The vessel was heavily overloaded, carrying passengers far beyond its safe capacity. In the narrow waters of the strait, the Italian naval corvette Sibylla intercepted the wooden boat to block its passage. During the maneuvering, the two vessels collided. The impact quickly capsized the Kateri I raids, throwing dozens of passengers into the cold water and trapping many others in the enclosed deck below. Official records and investigations from both nations present varying counts of the casualties, but the selected official tally identifies 84 deaths. Among the victims were many women and young children, whose bodies were trapped in the sunken hull. Dozens of victims were never recovered from the seabed, leaving their families with unresolved grief. Survivor testimonies describe moments of absolute terror as the vessel rolled over, plunging families into darkness. For the relatives of those who perished, the tragedy shifted the crisis from a political struggle to an intensely personal, enduring loss. Decades later, families continue to gather along the coast to memorialize the dead, still seeking legal resolution and accountability. The sinking remains a tragic physical manifestation of the human cost of the collapse, where a massive regulatory failure ultimately forced ordinary families to risk everything in a desperate flight for survival. In late March 1997, a multinational military force known as Operation Alba entered Albania. Led by European nations under Italian command, the 7,000-strong force secured ports, airports, and transport corridors to guarantee the delivery of international humanitarian aid. The mission did not attempt to disarm the population directly, focusing instead on stabilizing administrative centers to create the security conditions necessary for national elections in June 1997. The June vote brought a new coalition government to power, ending the immediate political deadlock. The restoration of political order could not mend the human toll. Government and international records indicate that approximately 2,000 people died during the 3-month crisis. Desperate for safety, tens of thousands of Albanians fled the country, with migration records showing that at least 70,000 individuals reached Italy and Greece during the height of the exodus. The regional security environment was altered for years by the looted armories. Hundreds of thousands of military-grade weapons remained in civilian hands, fueling local crime and crossing borders to supply insurgents during the Kosovo conflict. Government disarmament initiatives and international recovery programs eventually reclaimed approximately 223,000 firearms, along with quantities of ammunition and explosives. But more than half of the looted weapons remained unaccounted for, circulating through the Balkan black market. While public safety slowly returned, judicial accountability remained absent. A few operators faced brief detentions, but the principal architects of the largest investment schemes avoided prosecution. With their assets siphoned into offshore accounts or lost in the collapse, the operators left millions of depositors with no financial restitution, leaving ordinary families to bear the permanent cost of the fraud. The recovery of the state apparatus required a fundamental restructuring of Albania's financial institutions. To prevent a recurrence of the collapse, The Bank of Albania modernized its banking regulations and introduced tighter supervisory controls over commercial lenders. Parliament eventually established formal securities regulation, bringing domestic rules closer to European standards. These institutional reforms helped stabilize the formal economy, paving the way for international normalization. In June 2014, the European Union granted Albania official candidate status, initiating a long-term integration process aimed at full accession. Yet, institutional updates did not instantly restore public trust, because the majority of depositors never received financial restitution for their lost life savings. A deep skepticism toward formal banking persisted for a generation. Analysts view the 1997 crisis as a structural failure of state oversight, rather than a consequence of individual greed. When complete financial deregulation met widespread economic desperation, it produced one of the most extreme market collapses in modern history. This historical pattern shares distinct structural elements with modern digital investment frauds. Between 2024 and 2026, international law enforcement dismantled cryptocurrency fraud rings operating out of Balkan call centers that targeted European citizens. These modern operations mirror the 1997 Albanian schemes by promising extraordinary returns, exploiting close-knit trust networks, maintaining opaque internal ledgers, and taking advantage of delayed regulatory oversight. However, significant distinctions exist. The 1997 schemes functioned as a parallel national banking system, processing physical currency within a localized, transitioning economy. In contrast, modern crypto fraud operates globally, using decentralized digital technology and operating largely outside traditional legal frameworks. This structural comparison does not apply to all digital assets, but it reveals how the basic mechanics of speculative fraud persist. When weak regulatory systems fail to protect vulnerable populations, the fundamental relationship between public trust, economic security, and state authority remains at risk. Today, Albania's path toward European integration marks a profound recovery, yet the structural lessons of 1997 endure. As global finance grows increasingly decentralized, the line between speculative innovation and predatory fraud remains dangerously thin. The technology of wealth creation continues to evolve, but the vulnerability of desperation remains unchanged. Join the conversation in the comments below.